must say, whenever I give a presentation with my Wharton colleagues, I really get PowerPoint envy, you know? Where do they get all those pictures? Where do they get all that cool stuff? Well, I think there's a secret office someplace in the building that does all this stuff, and nobody's told me where it is yet. And I think Anne felt sorry for me, because when I sent my slides in, she said, "Are there any pictures?" I said, "No, no kittens? No kittens, no. Jelly beans? No jelly beans, no nothing." So I got no jelly beans, no kittens. We just got this topic we're going to talk about in a minute, but before we do that, I wanted to say something about Christian's talk, particularly about Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is one of the most important figures of the 20th century. What you may know is that he had a patron, and the patron was Joseph Wharton. And Joseph Wharton brought him to the Wharton School, along with a guy named Edward Muybridge, who invented time-lapse photography. And they created time and motion studies, and they created what becomes the modern assembly line, and they created most of the ideas around, contemporary manufacturing and things. So, it was all here, right? So I'm going to talk about this topic here today, and let me tell you what the idea is around this. And it has to do with, in many ways, one of the great social experiments of the 20th century, which is financial aid. If you have parents who are older, but it's still the case around here, we have some colleagues who could still do this. They talk about working your way through college. And the idea was that people could go to college and not take out loans, not get financial aid, but they could work and go to school and work their way through college. And there were people who used to be able to do this, and they could do it in about 4 years. There was a New York Times story about this maybe a few months ago. Some of you may have seen it, basically trying to find anybody in the country who worked their way through college these days, and the answer is, for the most part, no, you can't. One of the reasons why you can't is because tuition has gone up like crazy, right? And everybody talks about how expensive college tuition is. What they don't mention is that most students in four-year institutions get financial aid. So majority of folks are not paying the full price, the sticker price of college tuition. And raising college tuition was done in part as a way to do a big redistribution exercise, and that is effectively cut the price of college for people with families who were poor. Right? So it was a massive redistribution exercise that went on, and that's what we're going to look at today. College students in the same institution effectively are paying for exactly the same education in very different ways because of financial aid. There are people who don't get any financial aid, and for the most part, their education is paid for by their families, by their parents. There are people who get financial aid, which is the majority of folks, and they get it in the following form. So they get it from grants, which means the school basically says, here's a chunk of money we're just giving you to go to college, some of your costs. Work study, which means that you are working while you're going to school, you're working for the institution part of the time, part of your package. And loans, which are an increasingly big part of paying for college. So there's at least 4 different ways that you can pay for college, but it's the same experience, right? You're all going to college. You're all getting what appears to be an identical experience except for the way in which you're paying for it. Now, conceptually, the interesting part about this is that we know now from cognitive research, and it's interesting how all of our talks today look so different than the talks you would have heard about when I first got here 25 or 30 years ago, which were much more about the rational approach, the rational mind, utility maximization stuff. And all these talks are much more informed, or most of them, by psychology and the way people actually process information. And that's true here. So one of the things we know is that we don't actually treat money as fungible, and that how we pay for things does matter in terms of how we treat them and how we enjoy them. So if you separate the payment from the consumption, you get some very interesting phenomena. One of the reasons we know, for example, that people pay for vacations in advance, like fixed price vacations, all-inclusive stuff, is that you enjoy the vacation more once you're there because you're not reminded that it's costing you a ton of money. When you're paying for stuff, it's unpleasant. It's coming out of your wallet, and you're saying, gosh, this costs a lot of money, it's painful. When you're consuming it, it's enjoyable. So if you separate the two, you can change the way you enjoy the stuff, right? And if you get a gift card, rather than just a piece of money, you get a gift card to go down to this store and buy something. That's more fun. It feels better because it doesn't seem to be costing you anything. You have to spend it, right? It's a gift card. You can't trade it in for something else. So that's more fun. So this is known, I guess, generally these days, the term is mental accounting for this idea that when you separate spending from consumption, you can get some very different kind of outcomes than you might expect. And that's what we're going to use to think about this question, because it turns out these issues here, the way in which you pay, ultimately these are all about separating consumption of education from when you're paying for it. There's a time difference here, okay? So that's the idea here. So what should we expect in terms of the way people pay for college and how it affects their experience? Well, there's two things we're kind of interested in here. One is how well do you do? Right? One of the things we know about separating payment and consumption is that you are reminded about how much something costs, you take it more seriously. So there's a famous sort of anecdote about gym membership. It's not clear it actually empirically is true, but it's a story that gets told a lot, that if you're paying for your gym membership every month, you tend to use it more because you're reminded about it all the time. I'm paying $200 for this membership, I ought to use it, right? Whereas if you pay for it for a year, people tend not to use it as much because they're saying, you know, I paid for it, it's a long time ago, I'm not really thinking about it. You don't use it as much, right? So when you're reminded about the cost, you may take it more seriously, and that might be true for education. So for work study, for example, right, you're reminded all the time that this is an expensive thing because you're spending your 10 or 20 hours a week working to help pay for your education. You're reminded about it. Does this make you take it more seriously? On the other hand, you might say, you know, maybe it's not as much fun because you're being reminded all the time of how expensive this thing is because you're kind of paying for it with your job all the time. Now, interestingly, there may be some alternatives. There's a counter-hypothesis here, and it's always more interesting when you're looking at studies if there's an alternative hypothesis that you're testing at the same time, right? So one of these might be, well, work study takes time away from classes and takes time away from studying, right? So maybe that would make you do worse in school, even though it's reminding you that it's important all the time. And maybe you've got to explain to yourself after the fact, was this a good experience? Well, geez, I worked at it all the time. It was hard. Maybe I think more of it because of that. That's the process of rationalization, making sense of it after the fact. So there are conflicting views as to what we might expect here. Grants, these are free. The school says, bank, here's a bunch of money. We're paying for part of your tuition for you. So it's free. Well, I'm not being reminded about it, so that must make the consumption more fun, but maybe I'm not taking it as seriously. But there's an alternative here as well. Maybe you feel a little guilty that they've given you a ton of money, and maybe you feel like, geez, I better take this seriously because it's a big gift somebody has given me. Maybe I make the whole thing more seriously because of that, right? And loans are the classic example of delaying the payment, right? You consume it now, and then you pay for it later on, right? Does that make you take it maybe less seriously because you're not paying for it now? It's way in the future, you're not paying attention to it. But it certainly might make it less enjoyable in the future when you're looking back on it and saying, was this college experience worthwhile? And now you're paying for it, maybe it doesn't look quite as much fun, maybe it doesn't look quite as golden to you as people usually talk about their college years, right? 20 or 30 years in the future. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, the data here are kind of interesting. It's a survey that was collected by the US government. I'll tell you more about it in a minute, but basically this data's been sitting around, nobody's been looking at it. You got to have one of these secret clearance things in order to use this data. People come around and monitor it. It's locked up on my desk. It has to be chained to the desk. I don't know who's going to steal this data, who's going to use it, I don't know. But they're really secret about this sort of stuff. Here's what's interesting about this, though, and let me make sure I got the right, this is the right slide. Here's what's complicated about this, right? What you'd like to do, if we're going to see our students who get financial aid in a particular way, do they do better in school? One of the things you might worry about is, are kids who are already smarter more likely to get financial aid, right? Are they more likely to get a different kind of financial aid? So this is a problem we call in statistics omitted variable. Something's left out that's driving both your financial aid and your outcome. And there are also other kinds of issues where these things happen at the same time, endogeneity problems. Makes it very difficult to answer this question, except in this particular period in time, right? This is going to be kids who graduated from college in 1994. So they were admitted in college by 1989, 1990. Back in those days, which seem like ancient history now, back in those days, there was something about financial aid which was very different than it was now. Financial aid was entirely need-based. Schools did not compete for students based on financial aid. The federal government more or less mandated the financial aid package you were going to get. It was entirely driven by your parents' financial circumstances and your own financial circumstances. That was it. It had nothing to do with your ability as a student, whether you were smart or not. And to make this really serious, a number of schools, including the University of Pennsylvania, used to meet in something that was called the overlap group. The overlap group of schools would all get together and compare applicants and admissions and saying, who have you admitted, who have you admitted? Let's look to see what you're offering them in financial aid. We're going to make sure that we don't compete with you in financial aid, to make sure every student got exactly the same financial aid package from the different schools where they were accepted. So the idea was to completely standardize it and make it effectively, in this context, exogenous. It's got nothing to do with your academic ability. It's got nothing to do with anything except your parents, basically, your parents' financial circumstances. That's it. And that is a pretty unusual circumstance, but it makes it really interesting in terms of the ability to look and see whether something interesting is going on about how you're paying for college, right? So that's what's cool about this, is the particular context where we're getting the data and this particular time period where public policy said financial aid is only going to be based on your parents' financial circumstances, not on your ability, not on your characteristics as a student, nothing about that, okay? So what do we find? Well, here's what's problematic, and my colleagues who are faculty certainly understand this. Sometimes you get a really great idea, you get a really neat sort of story, but the results are not quite so neat. So at the moment it's kind of messy, which means I have to beat it up a little while and look at it in a slightly different way, and maybe we'll find something more interesting. But basically, here's kind of what we find. We find some evidence that students who are getting financial aid in the form of work study do better. They get higher grade point averages, right? The problem is comparing grade point averages across schools is tricky, and that's what these data do. So we have to kind of look at it within majors. So if you compare engineering students, or you look at the math GPA of students across universities, and then you can start to see some of that. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there's some evidence that years later they are happier about their college experience. And why might you think that would be the case? Because they paid for it while they were in college a long time ago. Now we're looking back on it, not so bad. If you get a grant, this is surprising that people actually seem to do better when they get grants. Now these days you might say, well, that's because smarter kids get grants. But remember, in those days, that was not the story. You didn't get a grant because you were smarter. It was entirely based on your family income. However, people who got grants do not feel as good about their college experience years later, which is a little bit maybe counterintuitive. And loans, people who take out loans do worse on balance. And that is kind of what we expect, because you're not paying as much attention to school now. You're paying for it way off in the future. It seems to be free to you, so you're not maybe as focused on it. And not surprisingly, later on when you ask them, what did you think about this experience, they're less happy about it, less satisfied about it, because they're paying for it then. Right? They're still doing their student loans, still paying for it. College doesn't seem like such a fun thing to do because they're still paying for it, and it was something that happened 20 years later, right? 20 years earlier. So I think that's the punchline here. I don't think I had kitties coming out here or anything, or jelly beans at the end. But the idea here is that financial aid, first, a huge social policy experiment that's been going on, started in the US, started in the 1950s. It has massive redistribution effects. It's the biggest redistribution program in the United States by far in terms of where the money comes from and whose it goes to. It means that people are paying for college in very different ways for identical experiences. It wouldn't be too surprising if this has an effect on how people do. And maybe there's some implications for this in terms of public policy later on, certainly for schools in terms of how do you want to give people financial aid if it affects how well they do in school. I think I'm done. Thank you.